to Season 4 of the Art of Teaching podcast. I'm Matthew Green and I'm so grateful that you joined me today. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you that have subscribed, listened and reviewed the episodes. I really do appreciate you taking the time. Welcome to the next episode of the Art of Teaching podcast. I have the great pleasure of introducing you to another phenomenal guest, Dr. Fiona Young, an architect and researcher in the field of learning environments. Conducted through the Innovative Learning Environments and Teacher Change ILETC project at the University of Melbourne, Fiona's PhD research identifies strategies to support leaders in recognising and using the affordances of innovative learning environments. In this episode, we talked about the role of affordances in learning environments and how to create your own amazing spaces for learning and why they matter. Core to her role is enhancing learning opportunities through design and interpreting and bridging understanding between educators and architectural teams. I hope that you get as much out of this wide-ranging discussion with Dr. Fiona Young that I did. Please enjoy. Dr. Fiona Young, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Where are you phoning from?
I'm phoning from Sydney, and thanks for inviting me.
No problem. It's you're obviously, as we all are, working from home and trying to juggle family life, professional life, relaxation. How's it going for you being in lockdown?
We're definitely looking forward to the end. We live in a terrace house here, and so there's two of us working, one in the attic, one in the space I'm in, which is a spare room, and a 9-year-old daughter downstairs who's in year 4 doing the learning. So it's challenging.
Yeah, it's very diplomatic. It's chaos at our house, absolute chaos. I'm at the dining room table, my wife's working in the bedroom, and my kids are at daycare, and that's the only time I get to do anything. So I think we're getting through it. It's not always pretty, but we're looking forward to the day that we can actually go out and see people. I think, I'm sure.
Same, yes.
Quite possibly the most important question, what is your coffee order?
Wow, the funny answer to that one is that I love the smell of coffee, but I don't drink it.
Fascinating. Did you have a bad experience with coffee, or do you just not like it?
I actually do like it, but I think that my natural propensity is that I'm on a bit of a high anyway, so I don't actually need the impact of coffee.
Fantastic. Yeah, that makes sense. You do seem like you probably don't need that anyway. Like, you're already naturally quite curious and excited to be alive. So maybe caffeine will tip you over the edge. Who knows? Do you enjoy hot drinks at all? Like maybe herbal tea or?
I have been drinking turmeric lattes.
Lovely. Isn't it?
They're quite nice.
Yeah, I haven't managed to get into those. My wife's into them, and I don't really like the idea of turmeric and lattes, but maybe I'll have to try it.
Definitely worth a try.
Fantastic. What is a book that you have recently read that has had an impact on you? It could be within your field of architecture and design, or it could be much broader than that.
Yeah, this one, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm trying to plug a book that I'm working on, but at the beginning of the year, I started co-authoring the next edition of a book called Managing the Brief for Better Design.
Wow.
And as part of that process, so the 2 other authors, or there's 3 other authors actually, they're all in the UK. One of them is 83 years old, has been in the field of strategic thinking and design for decades and decades. And being part of this book with them has really exploded my thinking in terms of design and the process of design and how you do it for a sustainable future, and what you need to think about doing it in a meaningful and ethical way.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's really made me question, what I do in my practice.
Wow, that's fascinating. And for those people that are not familiar with your work, when someone asks you, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
Well, that's a really hard question.
It is a hard question. Yeah.
And partly it's because I'm juggling multiple roles. So one is that I'm a co-director of an architectural studio, Hayball, in Sydney, in the Sydney studio. I'm doing this co-editing of the book that I just mentioned. And I recently finished my PhD, which was through the Learning Environments Applied Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. And so I'm still collaborating with my supervisor in particular on publishing papers. And then I've got this 9-year-old.
Yeah.
In terms of when I tell people what I do, apart from the array of what I do, somebody nicely described it as being a navigator. And that's very much around being this bridge between education or educators and designers in rethinking the types of spaces and experiences for the future, and helping them navigate their way through to get the outcome that they aspire to.
Fascinating. I have so many questions. Dr. Fiona, can you talk to me a little bit about your research?
Sure. So my research is about the affordances of learning environments. And what I mean by affordances is that it's the relationship between the environment and the user and the opportunities that offers for the activities to take place. And so from a school perspective, it's in the context of the physical environment and the types of teaching and learning activities that can take place as a result of the space. But the thing that's really interesting about affordances is that these spaces don't get used unless the users can perceive the opportunities of that space.
Fascinating. And
that perception is dependent on the user's ability and their intentions of using it, and that is influenced by the socio-cultural context around them, so the school culture.
What were some of your assumptions going in to this research, and were they correct, or did you have to redefine some of those assumptions that you had?
Well, I think the project assumptions were that architects were much more familiar with the opportunities of these new learning spaces, because lots of architects were designing these things that are called innovative learning environments, or ILEs, but they weren't necessarily being used well by teachers. But in my research, when I was looking, I had two parts. The first part was understanding the perceptions of teachers and designers of these different types of spaces. And so in that part, what we found was that teachers were recognizing way more than architects in these spaces, way more opportunities for learning. And what that points to is the differences, the different professional perspectives of architects and educators, and the fact that we really need to work very closely together to develop a common language as we're designing and developing these spaces together.
Wow. That's so fascinating. And it sounds like in many ways that your research was sort of sitting on the fence or building a bridge between the experience of teachers and also that of architects. And as you said, really trying to bring these two fields together. Do you have a favorite architectural quote or one that really encapsulates what you were investigating?
I do, in fact, and that's partly because coming from, I think architecture is quite a traditional profession in the way it's taught, and people's perceptions of architecture is that it's about designing buildings. And what my research does is really delves into the opportunities and what the role of an architect should be. And there is a favorite quote that is from Hermann Hertzberger, who's this incredible architect who was doing amazing things from the 60s and 50s. But what he said is, architecture has unfailingly approached the designing of schools from a less than critical position. All the while, it seems, architects meekly followed their briefs and were mainly concerned with formal aspects of the exterior without busying themselves with spatial opportunities that might lead to better education and the role they themselves might fulfill there.
Gosh.
So yeah.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely a call to arms for architects to really look outside their own boundaries to really understand and step into the worlds of their clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it seems in many ways, just as teachers have to rethink about their approaches to teaching pedagogy and methods, and to, in many ways, question some more traditional methods. That is also the case of many industries, including architecture, to really get back to the purpose of why they are doing what they are doing.
That's right. And actually, that what you mentioned about teachers revisiting what they do, that's actually relates to the second part of my research. Wow. Because recognizing that perception is the critical thing to help these spaces be used the way in which they're intended. I looked at strategies to support teachers to transition their practice to recognize space as a resource. So the affordances of space to help them pick up the opportunities.
Yeah.
And so I learned so much from that, and used the techniques used there, working with my teams of architects to help them transition and rethink about what they do as well.
It's interesting, isn't it? That whole notion of perception. Would you mind maybe unpacking what that means and why that is so important?
I guess the perception is our own beliefs and mindsets around any particular context. And what's really interesting is that every single individual perceives the world in their own way. And that's because we all come from different backgrounds and contexts.
Yeah.
And therefore, in relation to these new learnings, when you come into a new learning space with all these different teachers coming to use a space that can be used more collaboratively, they bring different baggage with them.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's really important to help them shift their own mindsets is to be able to reflect on the past and to discuss this with other people, to understand what other people's perceptions are, to come to a common understanding of what these opportunities are, of these spaces, and how they might use them together, and what the protocols they might need to use them together are.
I'm just curious, when you think of the term design, what comes to mind?
I reckon it's changed from when I first started training as an architect. And now when I think of design, I think what's critical is it's about process, bringing people together, understanding what the context is, negotiating, understanding problem seeking in order to problem solve, to come to a new and innovative response.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful definition. I'm just curious, Fiona, when you're constructing these spaces, these incredible learning spaces, does it make you think about who the clients are? There's obviously the paying clients, which are the schools or the governments, and also the students that will learn the spaces.
I think you're right. You've got your paying clients, but actually I think of everyone who has a stake in this building as a client. And therefore, that's why this process is so important, that you actually have to bring in your end users into the process of design so that so that we all collectively can develop this shared intent, so that they have an understanding of how this building needs to be used, or how they need to think about transitioning practice to use this building. Because in a way, the project isn't a building. The project starts, in a sense, when this building is completed, for all those people, because they need to carry the life of that building forward. Yeah,
it does make me wonder how we don't often consult the students when we're thinking about curriculum design, when we're thinking about designing spaces in classrooms, and they are the ones that are going to be using those spaces. And I think quite often as educators, we make assumptions without actually asking the most important stakeholders, which are the bit of a renewed focus on the way that we use and interact spaces when it comes to learning.
Well, I guess if we think about the way schools have been designed traditionally, which was the cellular box classroom.
In the 80s. Yeah.
Well, even in the centuries ago.
Yeah.
That was designed for a particular type of pedagogy, which was around this idea of educating lots of people quickly and educating them with particular skills that they need for their jobs back then. And in a sense, that model has perpetuated.
Mm.
You know, so we all, for the longest time, when we thought about schools, that's what we thought about in our minds. We thought about classrooms, teachers at the front, students listening. And so I don't think people thought so much about the space. It was just the expected thing.
Yeah.
But I think more recently,
So important.
that, people have been thinking a lot more about learning.
Yeah.
You know, what does learning mean? And particularly, what does learning mean in this day and age when the world has shifted so dramatically from when those original schools were designed?
Wow.
And so therefore, there's been questions about what type of space supports the type of learning that we want our students to have now and into the future.
What are some of your favourite spaces? They could be schools, they could be, I know you worked extensively in museums, they could be cities. What are some of your favourite spaces that you've been to? How do they make you feel, and why are they so important to you?
Okay,
There's
so many of my favourite spaces, but if I start with an urban space, for instance, I live near Central Park.
Yes.
Which is, across from Broadway. And I feel like that space has been really well designed, and you can feel it when you go there because of the life of the space. And the life of the space is very much because of the types of affordances, if I can use that word, which I'll probably get to talk about later, in the spaces, the opportunities for different types of people to engage in different types of activities. And you can see that it brings multi-cultures, multi-generations together in the one space to have that vibrancy and to have that wonderful sense of community. So that's a really nice example of a contemporary piece of design.
I remember I did my undergraduate at Sydney Uni, and so I remember walking past what used to be in that space for many, many years, and it has been transformed. And I think it's really lovely to see some of those organic or those natural connections. I mean, you walk through the space and there are people there, like you're saying, of all ages and of all ethnicities, talking and collaborating together and having food and kids playing and running around. And it's such a beautiful, it almost feels like an oasis, like you're not actually in the city, but of course you are in one of the most densely populated parts of the city at Broadway. Are there any other, like I said, you worked extensively in exhibitions. What are some of the important features of exhibitions, and how do you create those spaces? Sorry, are there any similarities between those spaces, educational contexts, and also the spaces that you described at Central Park?
Yeah, well, I really like this. I like being pushed to think about the relationship between museum and exhibition spaces and learning spaces. And I guess it's really interesting that you bring it back into other types of spaces too. And I guess the really nice thing about exhibition or museum spaces is that they are about enabling people to make their own choices to find what draws them to it. And as a designer of those types of spaces, you think so much about people's experiences. And also that the content of an exhibition, or what a curator's message or story is, and what the objects are, and how to bring them to the fore in a way that the visitor would like to engage and delve in deeper and find more about it. And I think for me, and this was something I didn't realize till much later after my early career as an exhibition designer, that there's this really great relationship between designing learning spaces for student-centered types of environments where you really want the learners in these spaces, whether they're students or teachers, to find their own paths of things that engage with them in different ways, and to be able to be empowered to pursue that path.
It's so interesting, and just when you're talking, it made me think about the Museum of Contemporary Art, which is one of my favourite spaces. And to be honest, modern art for me for many years, I always found sort of quite intimidating because I wasn't really sure what to do with it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to engage. I didn't know how to interact with it. And one of the things that I love so much about going to the MCA, or Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, is that I feel like I can engage and approach these exhibitions in my own way. And so I can either go really closely and really look at them. I can step back. I can appreciate them in the broader context of the exhibition. And it's a space which is so non-confrontational and also such a collaborative and a really beautiful space. And I'd never really thought about, until I started looking through your work, I never really thought about why that was the case for me in the MCA. And I think it's really beautiful to see, like obviously that is done intentionally. That's not an accidental space. Someone has actually thought about the set out and the layout of this particular exhibition. But it was the first time I just realized the importance of spaces. And I also think about the Frank Gehry building at UTS. I just remember my wife, I used to work at UTS, and any opportunity I could get to go and pick her up and just stand in front of the building and look at it. I was late many times to pick her up from work because I was distracted by the building. But that is just, in another way, that is just so captivating and so unusual and so unconventional. How do you respond to buildings like that? I mean, what do you think about the Frank Gehry building or the Chow Chak Wing building? But how do spaces like that make you feel, ones that are unconventional?
Oh, I think unconventional spaces are fantastic because, as you say, they do make you pause and stop and look at your surroundings and actually soak them in a bit and appreciate and enjoy them, as opposed to things that are more run-of-the-mill that you probably don't even really think too much about.
Yeah.
You don't think about the experiences that they bring, because I too remember the first time I went into that Chow Chak Wing building and how exciting it was coming up that silver staircase.
Absolutely, yeah.
Coming into those, what were they called? The informal learning spaces that brought lots of different people together, kind of like the airport lounge. And that was relatively early in that, for having those types of spaces.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite cities?
There's a few favorites. I've lived in lots of places around the world, and so, which I feel really lucky to have experienced. And so if I can respond with a few places.
Of course.
I was thinking Palermo,
okay,
in Sicily, Wellington in New Zealand.
Interesting.
And Berkeley in California, which is where I studied for a year in the 90s. And
obviously very different space or very different cities. I'd be fascinated to find out what your experience was and also why.
Yeah, they are definitely very different qualities of city, but there's something very much around the idea of this melting pot of bringing together in quite an intense way. Like I think with Wellington, it's the geographical landscape which brings the city right into this quite small pocket with the beautiful water out in the harbour at the front. And there's this melting pot that brings together kind of quite a creative, vibrant hub. And then when you're in Palermo, it's just craziness with almost like the ruins and so much life of people and contrasts around you.
Yeah.
And then I think with Berkeley, I mean, that again is an incredible melting pot as a university town.
Yeah.
But for that one, it was, and also there's so much history there.
Yeah.
And also because of that diversity and this incredible, there was so many opportunities because of this university town that I think there's just incredible life and inspiring people and opportunities for incredible conversations.
Yeah, fascinating. We have so we have both studied at the University of Melbourne. I recently did my Masters of Instructional Leadership down there. Sydney and Melbourne are two very, very different cities, aren't they? In terms of layout, in terms of accessibility. If you could change one thing about the way that Sydney was laid out, what would that be?
Ooh.
These questions are not on the brief that I sent you, so we can always loop back to that if you like.
No, that's okay. What would I change about Sydney? I think I would make it so that there's more external opportunities for people across the whole city, because I feel like Sydney is pretty inequitable as a city.
So that idea of accessibility
to the outdoors, and also thinking about outdoor spaces for play.
Wow, fascinating. And look, Dr. Fiona, there's so many common threads that I'm starting to pick up, like words like collaboration, non-confrontational, accessibility, equitable, like all of these sort of ideas that have really got me thinking about my classroom for when we finally return back to school, about what are some of the important things about these spaces. And if you wouldn't mind, let's take it back to the beginning. Why did you, so what were you like at school? And also, why do you think you have ended up in such a fascinating career as an architect working with schools now? What were you like at school?
Well, I think I was probably a relatively good kid.
Yeah.
But I was also interested in lots of things at school. So on one level, I was part of the athletics team for a number of years, but then I was also not bad academically as well. So I was able to balance those things.
Where did you go to school, just out of interest?
Logan Park High School in Dunedin, New Zealand.
Okay. So Fiona, is there a teacher that has had a significant impact in your life? Take us back to when you were at school.
Okay, there was, and that was Mr. Warburton, who taught me social studies.
Amazing.
When I was in third and fourth form, and maybe even fifth. And then in the sixth form, it was geography then. And he came up to me out of the blue and said, "Have you ever thought about being an architect?" And it had never, ever crossed my mind. So he then helped me get a work experience opportunity, which I believe was at his cousin's architectural practice in Dunedin.
Wow.
I know. And so after that 1 week of doing that work experience, I thought, wow, this seems like this could be a really great, exciting thing for me to pursue. So that's when I studied architecture.
So I'm just curious, why did he think architecture would be, I mean, it obviously was a great decision for you to go into architecture, but why did he think that you would thrive in that particular industry? It seems a bit left field during a geography and social studies class, but why do you think he said that to you?
I would love to know as well. And I'm actually friends with Mr. Warburton's daughter.
Lovely.
And about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, before Mr. Warburton passed away, sadly, I connected with him again and I asked him, but he couldn't remember why.
Did he remember the conversation?
Not really, but he was, because of my friend, he was always conscious that I've always said in a number of times it was because of him that this happened.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I don't know who said this, but I remember somebody telling me that it's very difficult to connect the dots looking forward, but looking back, it seems to make sense. Does that career path, did that make sense to you? Did you sort of have a natural propensity to appreciate and understand spaces? Were you particularly critical or observant when you went into a space that you didn't like, or does?
I don't know. I think it might have been just the way that I represented and drew things.
Yeah, wow.
It's part of it. But I think that comment that you made, when you reflect back, things make a lot more sense. For me, that really does resonate in terms of my career, because I feel like I haven't had a linear career path by any means, and that's what's led me to this funny hybrid position that I'm in now.
Wow. That's really interesting, and that's one of the common threads with so many people that I've spoken to on the podcast, including people that I thought, surely you're so well accomplished, surely it was a clear linear path, like, because to be able to achieve what you had in your lifetime, it doesn't really, you need to kind of get started at an early age. But so many people, I think, have, at least that who I've interviewed, have really followed that curiosity and that those kind of breadcrumbs to particular different interests. And why move from designing exhibition spaces to designing schools and learning spaces? What was the transition from that like for you?
It was really interesting because I loved exhibition design. And in 2006, I moved to Dublin to work. And because there was this boom over there and they were desperately looking for designers. And so I moved to a company that actually did retail design because I thought it had a really strong correlation to exhibition design. And at the time, I realized it wasn't as great a connection as I wanted at that particular point in time. But then I worked for a company where I worked on a school. And that was really inspiring for me. And one of the things I learned when I did exhibition design was how much joy it brought to be designing something for the general public, for lots of people, instead of designing a singular house for, you know, a couple or a family. You're making more impact on more people.
Yeah.
And that was the same with schools. But the second project I worked on was for an order of nuns in Cork, and that was the South Presentation Order. And this was the order that started education in all of Ireland before the government was dealing with mainstream education. And now that in their enclosed order, they had about 5 elderly nuns living there, they knew they needed to do something with their building moving forward. And the government weren't dealing with, they wanted to do something that the government weren't dealing with, which was people that didn't fit mainstream education.
Wow.
So they were looking at putting a not school into that place.
Wow.
And as part of that project, they had as one of their educational specialists, Professor Stephen Hayball, and another one was Sean McDougall from Stakeholder Design, also in the UK. And so for me, being part of that project, like I was exposed to this whole different world of educational thinkers and essentially what learning could be.
Wow.
And so that was the beginning of my journey of getting into the research side, realizing there was this whole new world and just digging deeper and deeper in relation to how I, as an architect, could support and help influence this way of thinking.
Wow, it's fascinating, and so many questions I have for you about that. I actually interviewed Professor Hayball last night, and he was one of the most fascinating conversations I have ever had, and it was just so inspiring. I was absolutely exhausted after our wide-ranging discussion, and I went to bed. But really, really, really interesting. So it's lovely to see that there's a relationship with you both there. It's really interesting to see.
Well, Stephen's been such a huge influence on me, and we've collaborated on things since. And so that's really nice, that connection.
Yeah, really lovely. And I'm just going to digress for a moment. You mentioned retail design. Do you have any thoughts on how the retail space is changing?
Well, I think, as you say, the online world of retail is growing and becoming a huge thing. But I think what's really important, the retailers are also recognizing the importance of the physical and creating an experience for people to want to come to, so that people actually get to understand the brand and want to buy into it, so that they can continue to buy online. So
it's so fascinating, isn't it? And like, sorry, this is just an aside, but for me, I would now take my children to Westfield for the experience of going to Westfield, because everything I can get at Westfield, I can get online now. And for the same price. So there's really no need to interact with people anymore, especially with great refund and return policies. But I just find that really fascinating, the investment into these new collaborative spaces, these new places where shopping is an experience as opposed to just a transaction. But yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah.
I was just thinking that's very much like the way in which we think about sticky learning environments, the sticky university campus, that you actually have to think about the experience in order to draw people there, because you want to create that vibrancy which draws them back.
Fantastic. I did an interview a little while ago with a gentleman from Tezuka Architects in Japan, who developed the circular kindergarten, which I think is so simple and so genius. And he was saying that the great thing is that if kids have enough and decide to run away, they will eventually just come back because it's a circle. But I find that space endlessly fascinating. I would love to visit it once all of this COVID is over. But yeah, are you familiar with that space?
Oh, yes. I've visited a few times.
Have you visited it? Wow.
Yeah, and it's definitely as good, and it's way better actually than the pictures.
Yeah.
And I know, I actually know Taka well,
oh, wow.
Tezuka, and have collaborated with him on a few things. And yeah, we dovetail really well with our work, where I bring the learning thinking in terms of the pedagogical opportunities of space, and then he brings his incredible, beautiful, creative brain of how to wrap that around amazing architecture.
Amazing. And I would love to visit that. So I will let you know when I can finally get over there, and how the space made me feel. I just want to read a quote which I found fascinating from your website. And it says, a 2018 study of 20 independent schools in Brisbane revealed that boys' schools had 3 times the amount of outdoor play space within their immediate school grounds than girls' schools. What role do you think design plays in either reinforcing or breaking down these gender stereotypes?
That's fine. I think that questions or discussion around gender and school spaces is a really tricky one, because often when you get asked about that, you feel like you're being asked for a binary answer, that this type of space is better for boys and this type of space is better for girls. And I know through the research that I've done around that type of thing that, you know, there may be certain propensities for some boys or some girls to like certain things, but you can't stereotype and say that's the case for all of them.
Absolutely.
And when you step back and look at it, you actually realize that, you know, spaces that are diverse, spaces that enable choice, spaces that have beautiful light, spaces that are aesthetically pleasing, they're the types of spaces that people love, whether they're boys or girls.
Exactly. Yeah.
But having said that, I think that quote that you read is interesting, because that relates to a little bit of research around outdoor play spaces and schoolyards. And particularly the work of Fatima Aminpour, where she found that in her research, a lot of girls in particular liked the in-between spaces, not the big open sports fields that often schools are synonymous with, but more of these kind of smaller pockets of spaces, and even the spaces that are generally out of bounds, the more intimate spaces.
Why is that important in terms of learning spaces, or is that important?
I think it's definitely important. And I guess one of them is actually the connection to nature is a really important aspect of learning. And in fact, I guess with the Barrett and Zhang research, it shows that, in fact, you have higher rates of creativity in writing when you are connected to the outside or connected to nature.
Wow.
And another thing is that it's an asset. It's like, you shouldn't just be thinking outdoors for play and indoors is for learning, but learning can take place anywhere in school. And why not be able to open your doors so that learning can continue to the outside?
What has your experience been working on vertical schools? And do you think that that is a new trend in terms of school design?
I've actually worked on quite a few different vertical schools, and both in terms of the actual buildings, such as APHS, Phillip High School in Parramatta, and also propositions for others. So I do understand what the issues and complexities are of them. But maybe just stepping back, there is more of a movement, or there has been more of a movement towards them over the last maybe 6 or so years.
Yeah.
And I mean, definitely that is a response to increasing population, urbanisation, and a lack of land, and also the cost of buying a plot of land in order to create a school big enough to accommodate the population.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there do we still need to have the same considerations when designing these spaces in terms of accessibility, creating opportunities for collaboration, creating equitable spaces, or are there different things we need to consider when building within these restraints?
I think they're all important, but there are different things, because just the practicalities of how do you operate a vertical school come into play. And it's not a matter of just taking a horizontal school and flipping it upwards.
Flipping it up,
and saying that, you know, year 3 is here and year 4 is there. But I think you actually need to completely step back and reconceptualize your educational model in order to make that vertical school experience the best experience it can be for the students and the teachers using it. And that's possibly quite different.
Yeah, it's so important. And I was thinking, as you were talking about the wonderful vertical gardens that are on at Central Park as you drive through Broadway. And I remember seeing those for the first time and thinking, gardens don't go upwards. And then I thought, hang on a second, what is a garden? Why can't this be the case? And I'm sure that's the same when you're designing some of these new spaces, is actually to challenge some of those assumptions and go, okay, like what are the essential qualities of, in this case, a school or a learning environment, and how can we utilize the space that we have most efficiently? But it's really, really interesting in seeing some of those designs, especially schools in Sydney, and also in sort of Western Sydney, so around the Parramatta Way, seeing just how those designs are made. And do you think this is ushering a new era of school learning and design, or do you think we will stick with what we've traditionally known, which is small boxes?
I don't think we can stick with what we know. Because of those pressures that I said. So I do think that we will be thinking more about how to make the most of what opportunities and land that we can get. Which then also makes you also think about how to be efficient and effective with the vertical school that you put in there. Because when you think of vertical schools, they are generally part of an urban environment. And so you've got a community around that school. What are the opportunities to make this school the centre of the community? How do you make it more porous? I know you have to deal with security, but you can also deal with porosity at the same time, and creating a space for the community, what the school can give back to the community as well.
It sounds like your time working in exhibition design really feeds in nicely to what you're doing now, thinking about the ways that people, these spaces are accessible. You're talking about creating porous spaces, collaborative spaces. Do you think there's a lot of parallels between what you did previously and what you're currently doing?
I think there are, and that was really nice to hear you unpack that, because after my first stint as an exhibition designer, one of my really good friends said to me, after some conversation, said, "You think differently now. You speak differently about what you do." And I thought, wow, really? Because
that's a lovely compliment.
It was a lovely compliment. And I feel like just because you're always so busy doing, you don't often have the time to step back to reflect on what you've done and why you do it. And that's why it's quite nice to have these opportunities, to have these conversations.
I think that is, like I said, such a wonderful compliment from your friend. And have you always been you seem like an endlessly curious person, somebody that asks a lot of questions and really kind of ponders. Is that something that you have always done, or is that something which you have developed, that curiosity?
I suspect it might be something I've always done, but I feel like there was one pivotal point in my education, which was a turning point for me. And in 1992, I went on exchange to the University of California in Berkeley.
Yeah.
And I lived in a dorm called International House, where there was, I think, 60% international students and 40% Americans from all different ages, all different backgrounds and studies.
Yeah.
And so I just met so many fascinating people. I learned about my lawyer friends and other types. I had a roommate who was studying political science. So that really opened my mind to different ways of thinking, and that was exciting.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. Not all schools will have access to these wonderfully designed learning spaces. Not all schools will have the funds to completely rethink their learning environments. So what advice do you have to those principals and educators when they're thinking about creating these inspiring learning spaces on a budget?
I think that's entirely possible.
Yeah, wow.
And I've seen it in action, actually. One, through my research, where part of my research involved participatory action research with teachers from 2 different schools.
Yeah.
And in that research, they reflected on what the issues were, and they determined what easy fixes they could make to their spaces to trial and test and to come back with.
Yeah.
And so that was a simple matter of moving furniture around.
Wow. Wow.
And involving the research of understanding what they wanted to achieve by doing so. So that's one easy thing. I also learned through my research other teachers who they might open a door that was constantly closed between 2 classrooms, but actually just open it and see, and those teachers would start to collaborate.
Yeah, wow.
And also I found in a research experience that I did in-house at Hayball with IGS, with my daughter's kindergarten class at the time. And through this experience, which we called Educator for an Hour, where architects came into the learning space and they did reading and maths with these 5-year-olds to understand how space influenced these children's learning experiences.
Wow.
But through that, we actually reflected with the teacher about what we found and what we saw and what the opportunities were. She got interested in it. She went away and did research over Christmas, looked up IKEA catalogues, and term 1 next year, she had completely transformed her classroom, both through moving furniture, buying floor rugs, and using her columns in a really clever way to create nooks and crannies and to put Lego things on the walls. So, that was a transformation. So I feel like there's lots of things you can do on a shoestring. And I also think Stephen Heppel's got some great examples of that in Madrid, which people can look up.
Yeah, Fiona, and your work is endlessly fascinating and so extensive. I mean, there's no way we could have talked about it all during this short discussion. But with the current COVID pandemic, most teachers, or all teachers, are working from home, and obviously classroom spaces are vacant. Do you still think spaces are really important? And what has this pandemic taught us about the importance of the physical environment for classroom spaces?
I definitely think space is important still.
Good.
And otherwise I wouldn't have a job.
Yes.
I can see that. I think the teachers have transitioned so quickly and done a great job of trying to make the most of a difficult situation with this remote learning.
Yeah.
But you can see that one of the big things lacking with the remote learning is the social side of education.
Yeah.
Like, kids really miss learning with other people, having other people around them and playing with other people.
Yeah.
And that's why you need to come together physically.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things this pandemic has taught me is just the importance of schools as spaces. And obviously the role of the teacher is absolutely paramount, but also the role of learning spaces is more important now than it ever has been before. And so, Fiona, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time. Thank you for calling me while juggling your professional career and your parenting responsibilities and all of that other life admin. And I'm incredibly grateful for your work. Where can people find out more about you and follow some of the work that you are currently engaged in?
First of all, thanks so much for the conversation. I've enjoyed it too. And secondly, I'm on LinkedIn, so they can connect with me there. And I'm also on Twitter, Fiona Y27.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll make sure that I put in all of those contact details into our show notes. But like I said, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. It's been wonderful to chat to you, and thank you for everything that you are doing to help create wonderful, collaborative and meaningful learning spaces for our children. So keep up the good work.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Fiona. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Art of Teaching podcast today. I hope that you, like me, got some valuable insights out of our discussion. For show notes, please visit theartofteachingpodcast.com. I've one favour to ask. If you could please head to the iTunes page of the podcast and rate and review the episode. This would really help to get the interviews and resources to as many people as possible. Also, I've created a private Facebook group so that we can continue the discussion after each episode. The link is in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and until next time.